Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about recruiting the right director candidate for your board. And joining me is Claudia Pici Morris, who's a consultant with Spencer Stuart's board advisory practice. Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you so much, TK. I'm happy to be here.
So it's no secret that a board seat is pretty valuable real estate these days. And when we talk about recruiting the right candidate for a current or even a future board seat, we are basically talking about a very important task that is upon the board and also typically the Nom/Gov committee. And it's a succession planning for the board. It should be equivalent to the succession planning for a CEO or other important executives. So, Claudia, my question for you is, what are the factors and the criteria that should be used by the committee in narrowing down a group of candidates that would be the right selection for their particular board?
Well, that's a great question, and actually one that requires a little homework before answering, because as you know, every board has a different need and a different skill set that they require. But what remains true is that the war for talent in the boardroom continues to be very strong. Board recruitment needs more planning than ever before. And unfortunately, it still only gets addressed when the need arises. And so it definitely limits the board's ability to attract the best talent to just who's available at that time. And according to the Spencer Stuart Board Index, our analysis continues to show a high demand for people from underrepresented community and women. So about 72% of the new director class in the S&P 500, which was about 395 individuals, came from underrepresented groups, and 46% were women. And that's both white women and women from underrepresented communities. So there is a huge demand still for people within that group. And so you have to think differently about how you're going to attract talent. But the biggest problem I see as you kind of start to think about this question is overall refreshment. It remains very slow, and it's the biggest issue for boards. Our analysis shows that boards still rely very heavily on retirement age as the mechanism to create refreshment. And it doesn't allow enough capability to bring new skills and perspectives to the board. So while most boards indicate they do a board evaluation, I think boards should really step back and consider doing peer reviews that are objective, that continue to analyze whether or not the board is fit for purpose. But with all of that aside, one of the most important elements of a succession planning is creating a comprehensive needs assessment, or a blueprint, if you will, in order to figure out the most important skills and criteria you need for your board. So this incorporates a number of different things. One is to refresh and rebuild your composition matrix. Too many boards still allow directors to self-assess, and it really becomes more of a check the box exercise and less of a tool. But it's critical to rethink the criteria and ensure that it's aligned with the current and future needs of the company. And so it's important to also limit and create more concise definitions to have a clearer assessment of where the board's true strengths and gaps are. Limit the amount that the director can claim as expertise to true spikes in their capacity. So that's the number one thing that all boards should do. The second thing is they should actively discuss and track directors' intentions regarding retirement. Even if they don't do a peer review, there should be an active discussion about how they're thinking about how long they're going to serve on the board. And with that, think about board leadership roles that need to be put in place over time. So such as the board and committee chairs, do you have people on the board today that can fill those roles, or does that need to be brought into your board criteria? And then finally, analyze the priority criteria and consider the next the most important criteria over the next 3 to 5 years to create a realistic specification based on the market. And ensure that you have a clear and differentiated articulation of your culture, of both your board and your company, because that's the most important thing in order to attract the best talent. That is the number one question we get when recruiting talent. So those are kind of some of the important things to make sure that you're setting up the right capabilities, the right position spec, and the right message to the marketplace.
So anybody that watches this show and know we have talked many times about the shortcomings of board evaluations and not having those tough conversations. And, you know, your research just sort of supports that, as other research does that's out there, which is unfortunate, and it certainly has hurt refreshment. But let's when we're doing this candidate search, let's talk about sort of, once the company has completed their due diligence, what kind of conversation or direction does the company need to give to a large cap or mid cap that's probably going to use a search firm, or even a small cap that may be doing the search themselves, you know, to find the right candidate? How should those discussions or steps go?
Well, first and foremost, I think you need to create a realistic candidate specification. Because refreshment is so slow, I can't tell you how many times a board will come with so many criteria for one role that they're setting themselves up for failure or disappointment. So that's why thinking about this in a longer term time horizon and putting together the right criteria where it can yield some strong talent from the marketplace is something that you need to really think about. So, for example, we constantly get asked to bring in a CEO or a CFO who's from an underrepresented community and active. And to be honest, that is just an unrealistic specification, particularly within the S&P 500. When you think about only 6.8% of CEOs are female, and only 11.5% of CEOs in the S&P 500 are from underrepresented groups. So that group of people is bombarded by search firms, or even directly coming from companies with requests to serve on their boards. And so you just need to think a little bit more broadly about the spec. We've also seen a bit of an increase in the demand for active CEOs. And again, based on our research, more and more active CEOs are taking themselves out of the market just because of the complexity of their current role. So you need to think about this in a much more proactive way, continuously scan the market for great talent. Think of it as a courtship. So you need to kind of think about the future director that you want, even if they're not available today. If you identify them, start a conversation with them. More and more, we're seeing that directors are committing to boards a year in advance of their actual appointment. So that's just going to make it harder and harder for companies to attract the talent that they want. The other thing I would say, just more broadly, again, if you are looking for people from underrepresented communities or women, think very broadly about that spec. Think about functional leaders. Think about line or division president roles or subsidiary leaders. In fact, 33% of the new class of entering S&P 500 directors were functional leaders, and much larger than the number of active CEOs. So that's just another thing to consider as you're in the marketplace.
So if I'm going through the steps, now I've got some candidates who sort of fit the bill. And the last part of the recruitment process seems to be that series of interviews, you know, that you might have with chairs or board members, CEO, et cetera. Who should be on that list internally from your point of view as far as the interviews go? And I'm sure every company's different, but what might be a best practice for who should be interviewing candidates?
So before I go into that, I think what's most important when you're thinking about the interview process is you need to be clear. Directors need to be clear on what they want to probe on: culture, interpersonal style, specific skills or experiences, what they need to bring to the board, just generally. And they also need to recognize that a 1 hour conversation, you can't cover everything. So committees should create interview questions for the interview teams in the first screen, and then other questions for later screens. And so they should take a more divide and conquer approach. We think not every director needs to ask the same questions. So search firms will have guides that they can share with their clients to help them think about this more strategically. But one of the most important roles of the NomGov committee is to recruit directors. But for the sake of efficiency, many set up subsets. So the head of the NomGov committee, the chair, and maybe the lead independent director may take the first screen. And then they may have the second screen be the rest of the NomGov committee and the CEO. And then the last screen could typically be the full board in a much more informal setting, because they're hopefully in the first two screens, they've been able to cover all the most important elements that they needed to cover to deem that candidate a realistic fit for the board. So that's what we would recommend typically.
Well, it's again, as you know, it's a process that's not always perfect, and every board's different, and every board is looking for somebody different. So it's always a challenge, but we both know how important it is to get this as right as possible. So we got about a minute left. Any other advice you would pass along to, that committee or that chair that is looking for the next right director?
Two key points. And the first one is start early. The board may meet someone that's not available for several months, but the companies do plan ahead in order to court those candidates. This is especially important if you want to get very specific criteria in your next director. Is just start early and think of it as a longer term courtship. And the second is keep an active list of candidates that you may be interested in, again, that may not be available today, but they are priorities or people that you aspire to bring to your board. And then just check in with those people periodically, and your search firm can help you do that. But also it would be nice to have either members of the board or the CEO reach out to those people just to build a relationship.
Well, Claudia, thank you for taking the time to join us and sort of lay out a good guideline for how to go through this process. Again, as directors seemingly play a bigger and bigger part in what's going on at their companies, this idea, again, of filling this seat with somebody that's not going to be a wasted seat is critically important. So I want to thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.